When people describe #alive, it's usually as a simple zombie survival movie. A guy gets trapped in his apartment, zombies take over the city, and he tries to survive. If we stop there, we miss a lot about what the film is actually portraying. #alive is memorable not because of the zombies, but because it reflects real anxieties in modern South Korea. The film focuses less on the outbreak itself and more on isolation, fragile systems, and what happens when modern life starts to fall apart. One of the most important choices the film makes is its setting. Almost the entire movie takes place inside a high-rise apartment. Apartments are the dominant form of urban housing in South Korea, especially after rapid industrialization following the Korean War. They are often associated with safety, efficiency, and middle-class stability. In #alive, that sense of security breaks down. The main character is constantly surrounded by people, but he's completely alone. The film makes this point very clear at the beginning of the outbreak. At one point, his neighbor enters his apartment. The key detail is that the protagonist doesn't even know the man lives next door. He doesn't recognize him, and they have never spoken. They've been living side by side with a single wall between them, yet they are complete strangers. This scene isn't symbolic guesswork. It's something the film shows directly. When the neighbor appears, it isn't framed as friendly or supportive. It's tense, awkward, and dangerous. That moment shows that the isolation in #alive didn't begin with the outbreak. Even before the crisis, there was no social connection to fall back on. This is not to say that the film claims apartment living automatically causes isolation. What it does highlight is a feature of modern urban life. People can live extremely close to one another while remaining socially disconnected. This lack of connection becomes a real vulnerability when a crisis hits. Another key element is how long institutional help took to arrive. Early in the film, we see emergency broadcasts and instructions. Then the signals fade and information becomes unreliable. For most of the story, there is no sign of rescue, no coordination, and no sense of protection. From the protagonist's perspective, help is inaccessible. The film doesn't claim that institutions never respond. In fact, help does arrive at the very end. A military helicopter appears, and the outbreak is clearly being addressed on a larger scale. But by that point, the damage was already done. This reflects something well documented in South Korea's modern crisis history. One key example is the 2014 Seoul ferry disaster. Beyond the tragedy itself, what stayed with people was the timing. Emergency messages were sent, but action was delayed. For hours, there was no effective rescue. That experience shaped public awareness around crisis response, not just whether help exists, but when it arrives. #alive reflects that same gap. Emergency signals appeared, but there was no protection. Survival becomes something the protagonist has to endure before systems regain control. Technology reinforces this theme. The protagonist, an avid gamer, turns technology into his lifeline. He uses technology to get news, communicate with others, and maintain some sense of connectivity. This reflects South Korea's extremely high level of digital connectivity. At the same time, the film constantly showed how fragile the connection is. Low battery, low signal, no Wi-Fi. When digital systems fail, isolation becomes immediate. The movie was not anti-technology. It showed the dependence on systems that can collapse without warning. Food scarcity adds another layer. At first, the protagonist survives on instant noodles and packaged snacks, everyday staples and symbols of convenience in modern society. However, once supply systems break down, that convenience offers no real security. The film isn't predicting shortages, it's displaying a basic reality. Modern urban life depends on uninterrupted systems, and when those systems stop, things begin to unravel quickly. One final detail that matters was tone. Unlike many Western zombie films, #alive isn't about heroic resistance or rebuilding society. There is no big team-up or triumphant comeback. Instead, the focus is on loneliness, mental strain, and emotional exhaustion. This fits a pattern often seen in Korean films, where stories emphasize endurance rather than a spectacle. The question isn't how do we save the world, it's how do you keep going when you're alone? And even when the rescue finally arrives at the end, it didn't erase what the characters had gone through. The isolation, vulnerability, and the psychological and physical strain don't just disappear. In the end, Hashtag Alive works well because it doesn't invent new fears. It amplifies anxieties that already exist. Urban isolation, distrust during crises, dependence on fragile systems, and the emotional cost of being alone. Zombies are fictional. The anxiety isn't.